center of the Conclave flagship's command bridge, her crystalline skin flickering with pale blue light that meant fear, though she would never admit that to the delegates watching her from their hovering platforms across the chamber. 12 species, 12 dying civilizations, all looking at her as if she held the answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. The hollow tide had taken another system that morning. The Varathi cluster, home to 9 billion souls, had gone dark in less than 6 hours. No distress signal, no final broadcast, just silence where there had once been life. And then the slow creeping spread of that horrible organic mass that swallowed planets whole and turned everything it touched into more of itself. Commander Taylor stood near the tactical display, his scarred Fenrathi face unreadable as the holographic map updated in real time. Another cluster of stars turned from white to black, consumed, gone, erased from the galaxy like they had never existed at all. And Taylor's watched it happen the way a soldier watches something he has seen too many times before. "We cannot hold the Myrth line," he said flatly, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the chamber. "We have 17 capital ships remaining, and the tide has more biomass than we have ammunition. The math does not lie, High Arbiter." Yelmvasa closed her 4 eyes and let the words settle into her like stones dropping into deep water. She had heard variations of this report every single day for the last 3 years, and every single day the numbers got worse. Fewer ships, fewer worlds, fewer people, and always more of the tide, always growing, always hungry, always coming. "Savant Kerr," she said quietly, and every head in the chamber turned toward the small, 4-armed Dreth scientist who had been standing in the corner clutching a data tablet to his chest like a child holding a favorite blanket. "Tell them." Kerr stepped forward nervously, his 4 hands fidgeting with the tablet as he spoke in a voice that trembled just slightly at the edges. He was brilliant. Everyone knew that. Possibly the most brilliant mind the Dreth had produced in 1,000 years. But brilliance did not make a person brave, and Kerr had never pretended to be brave. "I have been studying the Amaketh texts," he began, and immediately half the chamber groaned because the Amaketh texts were ancient religious writings that most modern scientists considered to be mythology and nonsense. "Please listen to me. The texts describe a race called the Khazul, beings of impossible endurance and unmatched ferocity, warriors who could not be broken and would not stop. The texts say they exist beyond a dimensional barrier, sealed away until the galaxy's darkest hour." "Fairy tales," Taylor growled. "Perhaps," Kerr admitted, "but I have also found something else, coordinates, buried in the mathematical structure of the texts themselves, dimensional coordinates that correspond to a real location in fold space, and I have built a device that can open a doorway to that location." The chamber went very quiet. Yelmvasa looked at the map again, the spreading darkness, the dying stars, the shrinking circle of light that represented everything that was left, and she made the only decision she could make, the decision of someone who had no good choices left, only bad ones and worse ones. "Do it," she said. They moved the rift beacon to the center of the flagship's main hangar, a massive device that looked like a ring of black metal covered in symbols that glowed faintly with an energy that made everyone's skin crawl, no matter what kind of skin they had. Kerr's hands flew across the controls, while technicians from 6 different species monitored energy readings that were climbing past every safety threshold anyone had ever established. "Activating the beacon," Kerr announced, his voice cracking slightly, and he pressed the final sequence. The ring screamed. There was no other word for it. The device made a sound like reality itself was being torn apart, which was exactly what was happening. The air inside the ring turned black, then white, then a color that didn't exist in any species' visual spectrum, and every sensor on the flagship went completely insane, and the lights flickered, and the floor shook, and Taylor grabbed the railing and bared his teeth and thought very seriously about shooting Kerr. Then the rift opened. It was a hole in everything, a ragged tear in the fabric of space that pulsed and crackled with energy, and on the other side was something bright and blue and completely incomprehensible. And then things started coming through. The first thing that came through was a ship, not a warship by any galactic standard, but a gray angular vessel with strange symbols on its hull that read DDG-118 USS Ardent. It tumbled through the rift and immediately began firing some kind of primitive projectile weapons in every direction, because its crew had apparently decided that if they were going to die in an incomprehensible dimensional event, they were going to die fighting. The second thing was a large yellow ground vehicle full of screaming adolescents. The third was a massive atmospheric transport aircraft that came through sideways and nearly crashed into the hangar ceiling before its engines kicked back in with a deafening roar. The fourth was a small group of bipedal creatures in combat gear who came through the rift already in fighting stances, weapons raised, moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had trained together so long they no longer needed words. The fifth was a single bipedal creature wearing short leg coverings and a shirt that said "Kiss the Cook," who was holding a flat metal cooking implement in one hand and a container of flavored liquid in the other, staring at his surroundings with an expression of total bewilderment. The sixth was a four-legged golden-furred creature that bounded through the rift with its tongue hanging out, tail moving back and forth rapidly, apparently delighted by the entire experience. Then the rift closed with a sound like a thunderclap, and everything went very, very quiet. Yelmvasa stared at the collection of beings now standing in her hangar, small, soft-looking creatures with flat faces and blunt teeth, and no claws, and no armor plating, and no visible natural weapons of any kind. And she felt something cold settle in her chest. "Savant Kerr," she whispered, "what are these creatures?" Kerr was frantically checking the beacon's logs, his four hands moving so fast they blurred, and when he finally looked up his face had gone the particular shade of gray that meant Adreth was about to be sick. "The coordinates were off," he said weakly. "By one-dimensional axis, we did not reach the causal seal, we reached a planet called," he checked the data again, "Earth, in a minor system in an unremarkable spiral arm. These are the dominant species. They call themselves humans." Thales looked at the humans, at their small bodies, their thin skin, their ridiculous lack of natural weaponry, and he let out a sound that was half laugh and half despair. "This is what we summoned," he said. "This is our legendary army of warriors, these soft little creatures that look like they would die if you dropped them from any meaningful height." Yelmvasa said nothing because there was nothing to say. They had used their last resort, burned their final option, torn a hole in reality itself, and instead of the mighty Khazul, they had gotten a collection of confused aliens from a backwater planet who were currently yelling at each other in a language nobody understood, while the golden-furred creature ran in circles around them barking. And then one of the humans stepped forward, one of the ones in combat gear, a female with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that swept the room the way a predator sweeps a landscape, not with fear, but with assessment. And she looked at the tactical display still showing the map of the galaxy being consumed, and she looked at the conclave officers in their ceremonial armor, and she looked at the hollow tide's advance markers creeping across the stars. And Gunnery Sergeant Elena Ramos cracked her neck, rolled her shoulders, and said 5 words that none of the aliens could understand yet, but would eventually change the course of galactic history forever. "All right, someone wanna give us a sitrep." It took 4 hours to stop the screaming. Not from the aliens, from the humans, because the passengers of United Airlines Flight 916 were not handling the situation well, and the teenagers from Jefferson High School were handling it even worse. And Dave Kowalski was standing in the middle of it all, still holding his spatula and saying, "What the hell?" over and over again in a voice that suggested his brain had decided to simply stop processing new information. Gunnery Sergeant Ramos fixed that. She did not ask for permission, and she did not wait for someone to put her in charge. She simply walked to the center of the hangar, climbed on top of a cargo crate, and used the voice she had perfected over 12 years in the Marine Corps, the voice that could cut through gunfire and explosions and the terrified wailing of 200 airline passengers. "Listen up, everyone, shut your mouths and look at me right now." They shut their mouths and they looked at her, because when Alina Ramos told you to do something, some ancient animal part of your brain simply obeyed before your conscious mind could even form an objection. She pointed at the massive crystalline alien standing at the far end of the hangar. "That is an alien, yes. They are real, no. I do not know how we got here, but I am going to find out. And until I do, nobody panics, nobody runs, and nobody touches anything. Are we clear?" They were clear. Captain James Ward of the USS Ardent arrived 20 minutes later with a security detail, having successfully convinced his crew not to fire the ship's weapons at the interior of the alien hangar, which had taken more effort than he would have liked. Ward was a tall man with gray at his temples, and the kind of calm, steady presence that made people trust him immediately, which was useful because the situation required an enormous amount of trust from everyone involved. The negotiations began awkwardly because neither side spoke the other's language, but Savant Kerr had built a translation matrix that adapted quickly. Within an hour, it was producing rough but usable translations, and within 3 hours it was nearly fluent, and the first real conversation between humans and the conclave of the 12 Suns began in earnest. Yelmvasa explained everything: the hollow tide, the centuries of war, the falling systems, the billions dead, the last desperate gamble of the Rift Beacon, and she watched the humans' faces as she spoke, trying to read their alien expressions, trying to understand what these strange, flat-faced creatures were thinking. Ramos listened without interrupting, which impressed Yelmvasa because Fenrathi commanders never managed to do that. And when the High Arbiter finished, Ramos was quiet for a long moment before she turned to Ward and said, "Sounds like they're in a bad spot, sir." Ward studied the tactical display. "How bad are we talking?" "Extinction level bad," Ramos replied. Meanwhile, the Conclave's medical teams had been running biological scans on the humans with their permission, and what they found sent shockwaves through the entire scientific community aboard the flagship. Kerr presented the findings to the Conclave leadership with hands that would not stop shaking. "They are from a Class 12 world," he said, and several delegates actually gasped because Class 12 was the second highest danger rating for a planet, reserved for worlds with extreme gravity, unstable tectonic activity, violent weather patterns, and an ecosystem so aggressive that most species would not survive a single day on the surface. Their planet has apex predators in every environment: land, sea, air, underground, even in the microscopic level. They are surrounded by organisms trying to kill them at every scale of existence, and they have not merely survived. They have become the dominant species through something they call persistence hunting. He pulled up a biological diagram that made Commander Thales lean forward in his seat. They do not outrun their prey, they follow it at a steady pace for hours, sometimes days, until the prey simply collapses from exhaustion. They are not the fastest or the strongest creatures on their world, but they are the ones that do not stop. The chamber was silent. "There is more," Kerr continued. "Their bodies produce a chemical called adrenaline in response to danger. It temporarily increases their strength, their speed, their pain tolerance. They become measurably more dangerous when they are frightened or angry, and their bodies can heal themselves, regrowing damaged tissue, sealing wounds, even reattaching certain structures if treated quickly enough. They also have redundant organs, 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, and a skeletal structure reinforced with a mineral compound that makes their bones remarkably resistant to impact. And they can operate without sleep for extended periods using stimulant chemicals they extract from plants and consume voluntarily." Commander Thales, who had called the humans soft prey animals 6 hours ago, was no longer speaking at all. He was staring at the biological readouts with an expression that Ramos would have recognized immediately if she had been in the room, because it was the expression of a soldier who had just realized he had badly underestimated his opponent. But the thing that truly silenced the chamber, the thing that made even Yelmvasa take a step back, was what Kerr said next. "They practice something called war," he said, and the translator struggled with the word because most galactic species had concepts for territorial disputes and ritual combat, but not for what humans meant by the word. It is organized, strategic, industrial-scale violence. They wage it against each other, against their own kind, and they have done so continuously for their entire recorded history. They have weapons that can split atoms, weapons that can poison the air and water for generations, weapons that can burn entire cities to ash in seconds, and they have used them on themselves. Nobody moved. "They are not from the sealed dimension," Kerr said quietly. "They are not the causal, but when I cross-referenced the ancient texts with their biology and their behavioral patterns, I found something extraordinary. The dimensional coordinates for the causal home and for Earth are nearly identical, separated by a temporal drift that corresponds to approximately 40,000 standard years." He looked up at Yelmvasa. The prophecy was not about a warrior race sealed in another dimension. It was about a warrior race that had not yet evolved. The Ameketh texts were describing these creatures before they existed. "We did not summon the wrong species, High Arbiter. We summoned the right ones, just 40,000 years before the universe expected them to arrive." The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that chamber had ever heard. Down in the hangar, unaware of the revelations happening above, the humans were doing what humans do. They were adapting. Priya Naidu, 17 years old, honor student, daughter of 2 linguists, sat cross-legged on the hangar floor with a borrowed data tablet, teaching herself the Velhari written language by comparing the translation matrix's outputs with the original text. She had cracked the basic grammatical structure in 2 hours and was working on idiomatic expressions by dinner. Dave Kowalski had wandered into the engineering section because the sound of machinery was familiar and comforting, and he had found a reactor coolant system that was leaking, and had fixed it using a sealant compound he had found in a storage locker, and a technique he had learned 20 years ago in the Army Corps of Engineers. The alien technicians had watched him work with expressions that suggested they were witnessing either a miracle or an act of insanity, and were not sure which. And Biscuit, the golden retriever, had discovered that aliens were just as susceptible to a warm, furry head placed gently in their lap as humans were. The Velhari, who communicated partly through touch, and had not experienced non-threatening physical contact with another species in living memory, were particularly affected, and 3 of them were currently sitting on the floor petting Biscuit, with tears running down their crystalline faces. Ramos found Ward in the observation deck, staring at the star map. "The swarm intelligence is predictable," he said without looking at her, "powerful but rigid. It uses the same expansion patterns, the same attack formations, every single time. It has never had to be creative because nothing has ever challenged it enough to require adaptation." "Until now," Ramos said. Ward finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite a smile but was close. "I want to train their soldiers. Their formations are 100 years out of date by human standards, and they fight like they have never heard of a flanking maneuver." Ramos grinned. "They are going to hate us." "At first," Ward agreed. The next morning, Ramos stood in front of 300 conclave soldiers and began teaching them things that made their commanding officers physically uncomfortable. Ambush tactics, feints, deception, misdirection, the art of making your enemy think you are weak so they commit to an attack that walks them directly into a kill zone. The alien soldiers were horrified and fascinated in equal measure, because in their entire military tradition, deception in combat was considered dishonorable, and Ramos had just spent an hour explaining that honor was a beautiful concept that would not stop the hollow tide from eating their families. Then the alarms went off. Every screen on the flagship turned red, and the proximity warnings began their horrible wailing song, and the sensor operators started shouting numbers that kept getting bigger, and Commander Thales appeared on the bridge with his combat armor already sealed. The hollow tide's next wave had been detected, the largest attack force the Conclave had ever recorded, heading directly for the flagship. Ramos looked at Ward, and Ward looked at Ramos, and something passed between them that did not need words. The understanding of two soldiers who knew that the time for preparation was over. She keyed the communications channel to the Marine Squad bay and spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly clear. "All hands, we have got incoming time to introduce ourselves." The swarm came out of folded space like a wave of living darkness. Tens of thousands of bioorganic attack vessels, ranging in size from fighter-class organisms with razor-sharp wings to carrier-class creatures the size of small moons, their bodies pulsing with the stolen light of every star system they had ever consumed. And behind them the void was absolute, a wall of nothing where entire civilizations had once existed. Commander Thales watched the sensor readings climb and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something worse than fear, the cold mathematical certainty that the numbers did not work, that there were too many of them and not enough of his fleet, that this was how it ended, not with glory but with arithmetic. The Conclave fleet arranged itself the way it always had, a layered defensive formation, capital ships in the center, escorts on the flanks, weapons batteries charged and locked at maximum range, and they began firing into the swarm the way they always had, exchanging energy volleys across the vast distances of space in bright flashing lines that looked almost beautiful if you did not think about what they meant. The hollow tide absorbed the fire the way it always had, losing individual organisms but never slowing, never stopping, closing the distance with the patient, unstoppable hunger that had consumed 200 star systems. "Forward shields at 60%, Thales reported to Yelmvasa. "We will hold for approximately 40 minutes before the line breaks." Yelmvasa said nothing because there was nothing useful to say about 40 minutes when you needed forever. And then Captain James Ward keyed into the Conclave command frequency from the bridge of the USS Ardent, and what he said made every alien officer on the channel question whether the translation matrix was malfunctioning. "Commander Thales, requesting permission to break formation and engage at close range." Thales stared at the communication display as if it had personally offended him. "You want to leave the defensive line and charge into the swarm in that ship, which is smaller than most of my escort frigates." "Yes, sir." "That is suicide." "Respectfully, Commander, it is not suicide if you do not die." Ward cut the channel before Thales could respond, and the USS Ardent's engines flared to full power, and the little gray ship shot forward out of the formation like a bullet fired from a gun, heading directly into the densest concentration of hollow tide organisms anyone had ever recorded. Every alien on the Conclave flagship watched in stunned silence as the Ardent hit the swarm like a fist hitting water. But instead of being crushed or consumed or destroyed, the human ship did something the hollow tide had never encountered in 2 centuries of conquest. It dodged. The Ardent rolled and twisted and banked through the swarm at speeds that should have torn the ship apart, its point defense systems blazing in every direction, its missile launchers cycling so fast the heat signatures lit up the sensor displays like a small star. Ward was not fighting the way the Conclave fought, standing still and trading blows at range. He was fighting the way humans had always fought at sea, closing distance, using speed and maneuverability and aggression to turn the enemy's size into a weakness. The Ardent passed so close to a carrier-class organism that the crew could see the individual tendrils reaching for them through the viewports, and the ship's main guns fired point-blank into the creature's sensory cluster, and the carrier spasmed and went dark, and the Ardent was already gone, already moving, already killing the next one. On the Conclave Bridge, Thales watched his tactical display track the Ardent's path through the swarm, a bright blue dot weaving through a sea of red, leaving dead organisms in its wake like a trail of breadcrumbs. And he felt something shift inside his chest, something he would later describe to Yelmvasa as the moment he stopped underestimating humans forever. But the Ardent was only half the story. While Ward drew the swarm's attention with his insane charge through the center, Gunnery Sergeant Ramos and her Marines were executing the other half of the plan. A boarding action on Relay Station Keth 7, a conclave communications hub that the Hollow Tide had infested 12 hours earlier. The conclave had written the station off as lost because the Hollow Tide did not give back what it took. Once the organic mass rooted itself into a structure, the structure was dead, absorbed, gone, and anyone still inside was already part of the swarm. Ramos had listened to this explanation, nodded politely, and said, "We will see about that." The Marines breached the station through an emergency airlock on the lower deck, and what they found inside was a nightmare. The corridors were covered in organic growth that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The air was thick with spores that made their breathing filters work overtime. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, they could hear movement, the wet shifting sound of the tide's ground organisms rearranging themselves. Corporal Danny Chen was the first through the door, and he came face to face with a tide organism the size of a large dog, all sharp limbs and grinding mandibles, and that horrible eyeless face that seemed to track you through vibration alone. And he shot it 3 times in the center mass, and kicked its twitching body out of the way, and kept moving without breaking stride. The Marines cleared the station room by room in 6 hours of the most brutal close quarters combat any of them had ever experienced. And they had experienced quite a lot, because human Marines trained for this, lived for this, had perfected the art of violence in confined spaces over centuries of bloody practice. The Hollow Tide had never fought anything like them, had never encountered organisms that moved in coordinated fire teams, that covered each other's blind spots instinctively, that communicated through hand signals when the noise got too loud for words, that got more focused and more dangerous the worse things got instead of panicking and breaking the way every other species did. Ramos killed 17 organisms herself, though she was not counting because counting was for after, not during. During was for breathing and moving and shooting, and making sure the Marine next to you was still standing and still fighting, and nothing else mattered until the job was done. When the last organism fell and the station was clear, Ramos stood in the command center covered in biological matter that smelled like copper and ammonia, and she keyed the comms to the Conclave flagship. "Relay Station Keth 7 is secured. You can have it back." Back in the main battle, the tide was turning, literally, because Ward's attack run had drawn a massive portion of the swarm away from its main advance, creating gaps in the formation that Thales was now exploiting with flanking maneuvers he had learned from Ramos that morning. And for the first time in decades, the Conclave fleet was not just surviving, it was pushing back. Dave Kowalski was in the Ardent's engineering section, because he had volunteered to help and nobody had told him he could not. And he was doing things to the ship's power systems that made the Navy engineers nervous, but that kept producing results, rerouting power from non-essential systems, bypassing damaged relays with jury-rigged connections, keeping the weapons online through sheer mechanical stubbornness, and a vocabulary of profanity that the translation matrix could not even begin to process. And somewhere in the chaos, Priya Naidu sat at a borrowed console on the Conclave flagship, headphones on, eyes closed, listening to something nobody else had thought to listen to, the Hollow Tide's own communication signals. "They are talking to each other," she said to Kerr, who was standing behind her with all 4 hands pressed to his mouth in astonishment. "It is not random noise. There is a pattern, a structure, a language, and it is all flowing in one direction." One direction, Kerr repeated. Everything flows inward, Priya said, her fingers dancing across the console as she mapped the signal pathways. Every organism, every swarm, every attack wave, they are all receiving instructions from a single source, deep inside their territory. She looked up at Kerr with the wide eyes of a 17-year-old girl who had just discovered something terrible and enormous. There is a brain, a central intelligence, a nexus, and if you destroy it, all of this stops. The battle ended an hour later when the hollow tide did something it had never done before in 200 years of relentless expansion. It pulled back, it retreated, it fled from the Conclave fleet and the insane little human ship and the soldiers who would not stop fighting and would not stop coming. Silence spread across the fleet like a held breath, and then one by one the alien ships began broadcasting a signal, a rising tone that cycled through frequencies in a pattern that the translation matrix took a moment to decode before it returned a single word. Cheering. They were cheering. Yelmvasa stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the retreating swarm and felt something bloom in her chest that was warm and bright and fragile. Something the Velhari had a word for that did not translate well into any other language, but meant roughly, the first light you see after believing you would die in darkness. Hope, she was feeling hope. But Ramos was not celebrating. She was standing at the tactical display studying the star charts that showed the vast territory the hollow tide still held. Hundreds of light years of consumed space between here and whatever nexus Priya had detected. Ward appeared beside her and traced a route through the darkness with his finger. A thin line threading through dead systems and consumed worlds, all the way to the heart of the enemy. "We are going to need a bigger fleet," he said quietly, "and a really stupid plan." Ramos looked at him and grinned the way only a human could grin, with teeth bared and eyes bright, and something wild and unbreakable burning behind them. Stupid plans are kind of our thing. The argument in the conclave chamber lasted 3 days, and it was uglier than the battle had been. Half the delegates wanted to press the advantage, ride the momentum of the first victory in decades, follow the humans into the darkness, strike at the nexus while the hollow tide was still reeling. But the other half wanted something very different, and they were not quiet about it. "You celebrate these creatures," said Ambassador Dren of the Sorvathi delegation, his voice cold and precise, his long pale fingers gripping the podium. "But I ask you to consider what we have invited into our galaxy. A species that wages industrial war against its own kind, that builds weapons capable of destroying entire worlds, that takes pleasure in combat. Today they fight the hollow tide. But what happens tomorrow when the tide is gone and these humans decide they want what we have?" It was not an unreasonable question, and the fact that it was not unreasonable made it dangerous. Ramos heard about the debate from Thales, who told her with the blunt honesty of a soldier who had decided he did not have time for politics. "Some of them are afraid of you," he said. "Good," Ramos replied. "They should be. Fear keeps you sharp. But we are not their enemy, and anyone who thinks we are has not been paying attention to what is actually eating their galaxy." She did not wait for the debate to end. She had never been good at waiting for permission, which was both her greatest strength and the reason she had been passed over for promotion twice. Instead, she and Ward began planning Operation Longshot in the Ardent's cramped wardroom, using star charts borrowed from Kerr and tactical data, pulled from every engagement the Conclave had ever fought against the tide. The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. A small, fast fleet would punch through the outer boundary of hollow tide territory and drive straight through 200 light-years of consumed space to reach the Nexus system, where a strike team would land on the Nexus itself and destroy it from the inside. "No reinforcements," Ward said, pointing at the map. "No supply lines, no fallback position. Once we cross into consumed space, we are on our own until the job is done or we are dead." "So a Tuesday," Ramos said. They put out the call for volunteers, expecting a handful and getting a flood. Because the battle at the flagship had changed something fundamental in the conclave, had cracked open a door that could not be closed again, and the soldiers and pilots and engineers who had fought alongside the humans had caught something from them, something that spread faster than any doctrine or training, something that had no name in any alien language but that humans would have recognized immediately. It was stubbornness, the irrational, beautiful, infuriating refusal to accept that a situation was hopeless just because all the evidence said it was. Commander Thales was the first alien to volunteer, bringing his personal warship and its entire crew, and when Ramos asked him why, he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "I called you prey once. I would like the chance to be proven wrong again." The fleet launched on a cold morning by Galactic Standard Time, 47 ships of mixed species and design, held together by improvised communication systems and shared desperation, led by a battered American destroyer, and commanded by a Navy captain and a Marine sergeant who should not have been in charge of anything larger than a platoon, but who had earned the trust of everyone aboard through the simple act of being willing to go first into every danger they asked others to face. The journey through consumed space was the worst thing any of them had ever experienced, and they experienced it in absolute silence. Dead worlds drifted past the viewports, planets stripped of atmosphere, oceans boiled away, continents reduced to smooth gray surfaces of processed biomass that the hollow tide had already absorbed and used and discarded like empty containers. And on some of those worlds, the outlines of cities were still visible, the shadows of buildings and roads and parks where people had lived and loved and raised children, all of it gone now, all of it nothing. The humans stared at those dead worlds and felt something dark and heavy settle into their bones. Not fear, but recognition, because humans knew what extinction looked like, had stared at its possibility on their own world more than once, had built weapons capable of creating exactly this kind of silence, and had somehow chosen not to use them, most of the time. Private First Class Maria Santos, who was 19 and from a small town in Texas, and had never been farther from home than Camp Lejeune before the Rift Beacon had grabbed her, sat in the observation lounge and cried quietly while looking at a world that had once been home to 8 billion people and was now nothing. Dave Kowalski found her there and sat down beside her and said nothing for a long time because sometimes there was nothing useful to say. And then he handed her a cup of something warm that he had made from alien provisions and human stubbornness, and she drank it, and it was terrible and she laughed, and that was enough. Dave had become something unexpected on this journey. Not a leader, not a hero, not anything dramatic, just a steady, reliable, unshakable presence that people gravitated toward when things got bad, the way cold people gravitate toward a fire without being told to do so. He had befriended an alien engineer named Skelt, a small, nervous Vryn with trembling hands and enormous dark eyes who had never seen combat and was terrified of everything about this mission. Dave taught him how to fix things under pressure, how to breathe when panic was pulling at the edges of your mind, how to focus on the next task and nothing else because the next task was the only thing you could control. "You just keep your hands busy," Dave told him, tightening a bolt on a plasma conduit with the same casual competence he used to fix a leaky faucet at home. "Your hands know what to do even when your brain forgets. Trust your hands." Skelt looked at Dave the way people look at someone who has shown them that the world is slightly less terrifying than they believed, and he nodded, and he trusted his hands. 3 days into consumed space, the fleet found something none of them expected: life. A distress signal, so faint it was almost invisible against the background radiation, coming from the ruins of a world called Vetha 3. And when they investigated, they found them hiding in the deep underground caverns, 7,000 survivors of a species called the Methori, who had been living in darkness for 26 years, eating fungus and recycling water and refusing to die even though every rational analysis said they should have died a long time ago. Ramos stood in the cavern and looked at the Methori, thin, scarred, some of them blind from decades without sunlight, and she felt something in her chest that burned like a hot coal. "You held the line when nobody was coming to help," she said through the translator, her voice rough. "That makes you one of us." The Methori survivors joined the fleet, and they were not the last. Over the next 4 days, the fleet found 3 more pockets of survivors on 3 more dead worlds, species that had been written off as extinct by the Conclave, clinging to existence in the ruins of everything they had known through nothing but pure will. The fleet grew, and with every new survivor it grew not just in numbers but in something harder to measure, something that made the air feel different on every ship, something that turned a desperate suicide mission into something that felt more like a promise. On the 7th day, Priya made a discovery that changed everything. She had been monitoring the hollow tide's communication signals throughout the journey, mapping the patterns, tracing the flows, and on the 7th day she called Kerr and Ward and Ramos to the Ardent's communications room and showed them what she had found. "The Nexus is not just a brain," she said, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "It is a cocoon. Every world the tide has consumed, every ounce of biomass it has collected, it is all being fed into the Nexus, building something, growing something. The hollow tide is not an invasion force, it is a larval stage." Kerr's 4 hands went to his face. "When the Nexus reaches critical mass, it will not stay in this galaxy. It will become a single organism large enough to traverse intergalactic space, and it will move on, and it will do to the next galaxy what it did to this one, and the next, forever." The room was very quiet. "How long?" Ward asked. "Based on the growth rate, months, maybe less." Ramos looked at the star charts, at the Nexus system still days away, at the fleet that was brave and battered and not nearly large enough for what they were about to attempt, and she made a decision with the same quiet certainty she had made every important decision of her life. "Then we do not stop," she said. "We do not slow down, we do not rest, we do not second-guess, we go straight at it and we hit it with everything we have." The fleet pushed deeper into the darkness. On the last night before they reached the Nexus system, the humans and the aliens gathered together in the Ardent's cargo bay. It was too small for everyone, but they packed in anyway, shoulder to shoulder and tentacle to wing and claw to hand, because nobody wanted to be alone. Dave made burgers using alien protein paste shaped on a heating element he had built from spare parts, and they were absolutely terrible, and everyone ate too. Priya sat with Kerr, and they talked about mathematics and language, and whether the universe had patterns that meant something or whether meaning was just something intelligent beings invented to feel less alone. And they did not reach a conclusion, but they agreed the question was worth asking. Ramos and Taylor stood at the edge of the group and watched their people, human and alien, laughing and talking and sharing food that was bad but shared. And Taylor said something that Ramos would carry with her into the battle and beyond. "My people have a saying, a warrior is not measured by the battles they win, but by the ones they choose to fight. I chose this one because of you." Biscuit the golden retriever moved through the crowd with his tail wagging, resting his head in every available lap, and Commander Taylor's, the scarred, hardened, legendary Fenrathi warrior, was seen sitting on the floor with the dog's head in his lap, stroking his ears very gently, and when someone asked him what he was doing he said, "I am having a strategic consultation," and refused to elaborate. Dawn broke over the Nexus world the next morning, not real dawn, because the system star had been consumed long ago, but a sick pulsing red light that emanated from the Nexus itself. A planet-sized mass of living tissue that glowed like an infected wound against the darkness of space. Ramos checked her weapon, checked her gear, looked at her team, human and alien, marine and Methori, Fenrathi and Vryn, and spoke words that carried across every ship in the fleet through every translator and every comms channel. Nobody was supposed to come this far, But here we are, so let us finish it. The Battle of the Nexus began with silence and ended with the loudest sound the galaxy had ever heard. 47 ships against a world made of hunger. Those were the numbers, and the numbers were terrible. And Captain James Ward looked at them on his tactical display and felt something settle in his stomach that was either fear or determination, and he decided it was determination because fear was not useful right now. All ships, this is Ward, execute Phase 1, punch the corridor and hold it open no matter what comes through. The strike team needs 12 hours. Give them 12 hours. The fleet surged forward, and the swarm rose to meet them. It was chaos from the first second. Hollow tide organisms erupted from the Nexus surface in clouds so dense they blocked out the poolsing red light. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, more than the sensors could count, and they hit the fleet like a wall of teeth and hunger. The Ardent led the charge because the Ardent always led the charge, and Ward drove his ship into the swarm with the same cold, focused aggression he had shown in the first battle. But this time the swarm was ready for him. This time it had adapted, and the first hit cracked the Ardent's forward shields, and the second tore a hole in the hull that the damage control teams sealed with emergency plating and sheer profanity. Thales brought his warship alongside the Ardent, and the two ships fought back to back, human and Fenrathi weapons firing in tandem, covering each other's blind spots the way Ramos had taught the alien soldiers to do. And around them the rest of the fleet formed a corridor through the swarm, a narrow bleeding tunnel of clear space that cost a ship for every kilometer it extended. The Methori survivors fought with a fury that made even the humans pause. 26 years of hiding, 26 years of darkness and fear, and eating fungus in caves, while the world above them was consumed. And all of that compressed into a rage so pure it was almost beautiful. Their ships were old and battered, but they threw them at the swarm without hesitation, because they had already lost everything, and that made them the most dangerous fighters in the fleet. The corridor opened, barely, held together with weapons, fire, and willpower, and the burning wreckage of ships that had given everything to keep it clear for just a few more minutes. "Corridor is open," Ward called. "Strike team, go now, go now." The dropship carrying Ramos and her team plunged through the corridor like a stone thrown into a well, spinning, dodging, taking hits that made the airframe scream. And it hit the Nexus surface hard enough to buckle the landing struts. And before the dust had settled, Ramos was out of the hatch with her weapon up and her team behind her, and the mission clock running in her head like a second heartbeat. The surface of the Nexus was alive. That was the first thing they understood, and the thing that made their stomachs turn. The ground moved beneath their boots, pulsing with a rhythm that was horribly similar to a heartbeat, and the air was thick with spores that glowed faintly in the red light, and the structures around them were not buildings but organs, vast cathedral-sized chambers of tissue and bone that rose from the surface like the ribs of something impossibly large. "Move," Ramos ordered, and they moved. The strike team was 30 strong, 12 Marines, 8 Fenrathi soldiers, 6 Methori volunteers, and 4 Dreth engineers carrying the demolition charges that Kerr had designed to destroy the Nexus core. They moved through the living landscape in tight formation, weapons firing at the organisms that erupted from the ground to stop them, and every step forward was bought with ammunition and blood. The deeper they went, the worse it got. The organisms got bigger, faster, more coordinated, as if the Nexus was waking up, as if it was becoming aware of the infection inside it and marshalling its defenses. And the strike team took casualties. A Fenrathi soldier pulled into the ground by tendrils that erupted from beneath her feet, a Methori volunteer crushed by a collapsing tissue wall. And Ramos marked each loss in her mind and kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing, and failing was not an option she was willing to consider. Then the Nexus spoke to them. It was not a voice, not exactly. It was a pressure inside their skulls, a vibration in their bones, a feeling of vast and terrible intelligence turning its attention toward them the way a sleeping giant might notice an ant crawling across its skin. It offered them things: peace, an end to suffering, absorption into something larger and more permanent than any individual life. And several of the alien soldiers stumbled, their eyes going glassy, their weapons lowering, because the voice was persuasive in a way that went deeper than language, deeper than thought, down into the fundamental animal desire to stop struggling and rest. Corporal Chen grabbed a Fenrathi soldier by the collar and shook him hard enough to rattle his teeth. "Hey, eyes up, nobody quits. You hear me, nobody quits." The soldier blinked, shook his head, raised his weapon, and kept fighting. They reached the core chamber after 4 hours of continuous combat, a vast hollow space deep inside the Nexus, where the walls were lined with neural tissue that pulsed with the collected consciousness of every world the tide had ever consumed. And at the center was a mass of biological matter so dense it had its own gravity, pulling everything toward it, the heart of the hollow tide, the brain of the beast. The Dreth engineers began setting charges, while Ramos established a defensive perimeter, and that was when the Nexus threw everything it had at them. Organisms poured into the core chamber from every direction, more than the strike team could handle, more than their ammunition could answer, and the perimeter began to collapse inward, position by position, and the engineers were not done. They needed more time, and there was no more time. Dave Kowalski was not supposed to be on the strike team. He had volunteered and been told no, and had somehow ended up on the dropship anyway, and nobody had noticed until they were already on the surface, because Dave had that quality. The ability to be exactly where he was needed without anyone noticing, until he was already there. He was at Junction 7 when the eastern wall of the perimeter fell, and he was the only one between the incoming swarm and the engineers planting the final charges, and he looked at the gap, and he looked at the tools in his hands, and he made a decision that was not brave in the dramatic sense, but was brave in the truest sense. The sense that means doing the thing that needs doing even though you are terrified, and you are nobody special, and you would really rather be at home grilling burgers. Dave held Junction 7 for 11 minutes. He used a plasma cutter to collapse a tissue wall into a choke point, then rigged 2 improvised explosives from engineering supplies and detonated them in sequence to block the secondary approach. And when a tide organism broke through the debris, he hit it with his spatula hard enough to crack its sensory plate, and then finished it with the plasma cutter. And when Skelt appeared beside him, trembling, terrified, but there, Dave said, "Trust your hands," and Skelt welded the junction shut with a precision that would have impressed engineers with 50 years more experience. 11 minutes. It does not sound like a long time until you are the one standing in the gap. The charges were set. Ramos hit the detonator. Above, aboard the Ardent, Priya executed the communication gem she had been preparing for days. A targeted signal burst on the hollow tide's own frequency, severing the Nexus's control signal at the exact moment the charges detonated. Cutting the brain off from the body, in the same instant, the brain was destroyed. The Nexus core detonated with a force that cracked the living planet like an egg. The shockwave ripped outward through the tissue and bone and stolen biomass, and the red light that had pulsed like an infected wound flickered once, twice, and went dark. Across the galaxy, across hundreds of star systems, across consumed worlds and infested stations and swarm fleets in mid-attack, the hollow tide shuddered. Every organism, every tendril, every spore and carrier and attack vessel, they all stopped at the same moment, frozen in place as if the strings holding them up had been cut, and then they began to die, collapsing in on themselves, dissolving, coming apart at the cellular level as 200 years of stolen life unraveled in a cascade that spread at the speed of the tide's own communication network. It was over. 2 centuries of galactic terror ended in a single shuddering moment by 47 ships and 30 soldiers, and a man with a spatula. The corridor held long enough to extract the strike team, barely, because barely was how humans did things. and Ramos was the last one through the hatch of the evac shuttle, carrying Commander Thales on her back because he had taken a hit to both legs holding the corridor entrance and could not walk. And when he protested that a commander should not be carried, she told him to shut up and be grateful he was light. Dave walked out of the Nexus holding Biscuit under one arm, because of course, Biscuit had also somehow ended up on the dropship, because Biscuit went where Dave went and nobody could stop either of them. And his dented spatula was tucked into his belt like a sword, and he was covered in biological matter and burn marks, and he was smiling the tired, satisfied smile of a man who had done a good day's work. The galaxy rebuilt itself slowly, the way galaxies do. Consumed worlds were reclaimed, their surfaces cleansed and seeded with new life by the combined efforts of every surviving species. It would take generations, but it had started, and starting was the part that mattered. The conclave was restructured, not the conclave of the 12 Suns anymore, but the conclave of the open hand, founded on principles the humans had taught not through speeches or doctrine, but through example. Adapt, improvise, never give up, and always, always run toward the people who need help. Earth was contacted, which created an entirely new set of problems because human governments were spectacularly unprepared for the news that their species had accidentally saved a galaxy, and the diplomatic negotiations were described by Kerr as more exhausting than the war. He was not wrong. Ramos was offered a rank equivalent to Supreme Commander of the Conclave's combined military forces. She declined, saying she just wanted to make sure her Marines got home safely, and she rode the Rift beacon back to Earth with her squad and was debriefed for 6 weeks, and then went on leave and sat on a beach, and did not move for 4 days. Captain Ward became humanity's first ambassador to the Conclave. He requested that the USS Ardent be preserved as a monument at the site of the final battle, and it was, battle scars and all, orbiting the dead Nexus world as a reminder of what one small ship could do when crewed by people who refused to lose. Priya Naidu received a full scholarship to the Conclave's most prestigious scientific academy, where she became the foremost xenolinguist in galactic history, eventually decoding 17 extinct languages and writing a paper titled Communication Across the Void that was required reading for every diplomatic corps in the conclave for the next 300 years. Dave went home. He finished grilling his burgers, which were cold but still edible after being reheated. Skelt visited him every galactic standard month, arriving in a small Vrin shuttle that he parked in Dave's backyard, and they would sit in lawn chairs and drink beer and not talk much, because they did not need to, because some friendships are built on words and some are built on standing next to someone in the worst moment of their life and choosing not to leave. Biscuit was formally recognized by the Conclave as an emotional support entity of galactic significance. He did not understand this. He did not care about titles or honors, or the fact that his image was now displayed in the Hall of Heroes, alongside the greatest warriors the galaxy had ever known. He was a good boy, and that had always been enough. On the day the new conclave was formally inaugurated, High Arbiter Yelmvasa stood before the full galactic assembly, thousands of species, trillions watching from rebuilt worlds and reclaimed stations and ships still patrolling the healing borders of civilized space. And she was asked to describe humanity, these small, soft, fragile, impossibly stubborn creatures who had changed everything. She was quiet for a long time, her crystalline skin glowing with a color that meant something too deep for translation. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the chamber and across the stars and into history. We searched the cosmos for warriors. We found something better. We found people who were afraid and fought anyway, who were small and refused to be less, who were mortal and chose to make that matter. She paused, and the light within her pulsed once, bright and warm. We summoned them by accident, but I believe the universe made no mistake. The assembly was silent for 3 full heartbeats, and then every species in that vast chamber rose to their feet and made whatever sound their biology allowed for the expression of something too large for any single language. A roar, a chime, a vibration, a song, and it filled the hall and spilled out into the stars. And somewhere on a small blue planet in a minor system in an unremarkable spiral arm of the galaxy, a man named Dave Kowalski stood in his backyard flipping burgers while his alien friend sat in a lawn chair beside him. And the evening was warm, and the sky was full of stars, and everything was exactly as it should be.